Okay, yeah, hi everyone. I go by XeroXMuto on Twitter, but we are building Ethos, which we hope to be the ETH restake hub for Cosmos, and then really for all kind of alternative ecosystems going forward in crypto. So a quick little intro on what Cosmos is, in case anyone is unfamiliar. Essentially, it's a set of chains, primarily app chains, secured by their own validator set, often running the Cosmos SDK, and primarily running Tendermint consensus. This is important later, but often these validator sets are kind of concentric circles where they're often validating each other's, and there's a lot of overlap there. And then moving forward, a lot of these chains are secured by IBC, which is essentially secure light client bridging, possible because of the homogeneous security. And so one of the kind of important parts if you're building an app chain is basically how do you secure this chain? And so the kind of canonical way to do this is you launch your own token, you use that as part of your proof of stake network, and that's kind of how you accrue value to your token as well as basically secure your chain. This is obviously quite difficult. I think one of the primary concerns around this, especially within Cosmos and other ecosystems, is just how you actually bootstrap this trust layer. And so often the way this happens in reality is you do like this off-chain roadshow, you go around and you kind of have 40 to 50 conversations with important people in the space, influencers and other node operators, and get everyone on board. And so in order to mitigate this problem, something that the Cosmos Hub has recently introduced is this idea of shared security, and specifically what they're building of called replicated security. And so the way that the hub is building replicated security is essentially you take the validator set, which is running the Cosmos Hub, and you just run your consumer chain next to it. And so it essentially means every node operator is now running another chain. And so this is already in place with some chains like Stride and Neutron, and it's starting to grow out. I think this solves quite the important problem, which is how do you actually bootstrap this validator set, but at the cost of essentially sovereignty over your validator set, and often in many cases it also kind of sabotages how you actually do value accrual for your token, which was talked about earlier. The other issue with replicated security is essentially how do you actually scale out the system? As you can imagine, if every operator is just running another node for every other chain, it basically scales up pretty poorly. And so another initiative that was introduced, and kind of the reason we're here today, is this idea of mesh security. So mesh was pioneered by Sunny at Osmosis, and it's basically the idea of like, could you take replicated security and fully kind of generalize it? With the idea being that you can have n number of chains, and they communicate bidirectionally, and they basically send and share security between each other. The way this works at the technical level is you essentially have sets of provider chains and then consumer chains, and provider chains basically have an eigenlayer-like system, which essentially locks up your native stake, subjects it to slashing conditions on the consumer chain, and basically says, I'm going to lock these up in order to lend them to the consumer chain. It sends that message over IBC. The consumer chain receives this and mints a set of virtual tokens, which are only useful as part of proof of stake, and basically supplements their security. And so you can imagine this as basically supplemental virtual security. And so what Ethos is building is essentially we're building this, but with ETH as the provider chain. And so you can imagine EigenLayer obviously handles a lot of how we manage native staking. And so what we're enabling is basically the communication layer into Cosmos. And so through this, you can imagine Ethos as essentially a single entry point from the restaker's perspective. It's essentially you restake with Ethos, and it gives you access to a portfolio of Cosmos-based yields, which is generally from inflationary token rewards, but also from like block fee rewards and other mechanisms. In terms of how the AVS actually operates, the AVS is essentially the operators are running our Ethos L1, which acts as a very minimal bridge from ETH state into Cosmos, and then communicates over IBC to consumer chains. And then the operators also register their delegation to consumer chain validators. In practicality, this delegation is likely to their own address where they're running their own consumer validator, just because that's kind of the targets of operators that we've been working with. And then slashing happens kind of as you would expect, where if the consumer chain is slashed, there will be directly attributable and objective proof, which can then be submitted onto EigenLayer, and we slash it against our AVS. So kind of at a meta point, I think one of the important points of why Ethos makes sense and why we're building it out is essentially slashing or staking to date is essentially this kind of zero-sum game where if I'm securing a chain here, I can't be securing a chain here. And kind of the reason for this is kind of obvious, and I think that's why EigenLayer basically provides this new opportunity. EigenLayer, essentially the way I like to describe it is that they're bringing down the opportunity cost for incremental stake to be used to secure other chains. And so you can imagine if you have the whole Cosmos ecosystem today, which generously you could say is on the low billions of, say, TVL or security, This allows you to get instant access to all of ETH-based security at essentially zero cost, and for restakers, it gives them this access to incremental yield. So for us right now, what we're building at Ethos, this is kind of our timeline. Currently, we have our DevNet, which I'm about to show a demo of. And then by end of year, we're targeting to have our testnet launched, which will be a POA testnet on Cosmos. And we'll also be working with a limited operator set on EigenLayer. And then consumer chains, which are already customers that we're talking to, will be launching essentially a module, which is how Cosmos works, where you install this module on your chain, and we'll be running testnets against that. Mainnet launch, we're targeting with EigenLayer next year. And so here starts our demo. You can essentially see here's how we register the operator. This then gets processed onto this first is showing ETH, and then it shows on the L1. We then can go here and see on the consumer chain that some virtual tokens are minted. We then deposit 100 more tokens. You can see on the terminal here that I'm then checking that on the Ethos chain that's reflected, and then on the consumer chain that's also reflected by this virtual tokens. So this will loop here, but essentially the mechanism here is that we have a consumer chain running the Ethos module, we have the Ethos L1, and then we have our EigenLayer AVS contracts. And so you can see that the state essentially basically waterfalls down to the consumer chain to supplement their security module. That's all for today, and here's how you can reach us if you have any questions. Thank you.